Wednesday. You know what that means. Time for the Southern California Writers Association Hump Day Book Tour. I'm your host, Maddie Margarita, here with Diana Pardee on tech. Every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m., the Southern California Writers Association turns our Facebook page over to a new writer to talk about their book and or books and their work. This morning, we're pleased to have with us Seamus Beirne. Irish-born writer Seamus Beirne spent 30 years as a high school English teacher and administrator. Before that, he worked as a priest in a Catholic high school and in neighboring parishes. He's received the Conference Choice Award for adult fiction, San Diego Writers Conference 2010, 2011, and 2012. I had a lock on that there, Seamus. Runner-up for adult fiction, San Francisco Writers Conference 2010, finalist in the Pacific Northwest Writers Association Conference 2011. His novels include Breakout from Sugar Island, Search of Brigid, Coltrane, and his latest Kings Mountain. Welcome, Seamus.
Well, thank you for having me, Maddie. It's great to be here.
I always love talking to you. You have such an interesting perspective on writing and on history. And as we were saying, I just love the premise for Kings Mountain and your approach and your vision. So can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write this story and what was it that inspired you?
Sure. I've always had a love of history, so briefly tell you where I got the premise for the first novel, which Kings Mountain is a sequel to Breakout from Sugar Island. In reading Irish history, I discovered that back in the 17th century, 80,000 Irish men and women were transported to the penal colony of Barbados, the sugar colony, by Cromwell. So that's where the inspiration for that novel came. The new novel, Kings Mountain, is a follow-up to that. And it tracks the fortunes of the two main characters, Redfern and Isaac Mallow. Isaac is a black man from Africa, from Sierra Leone, and Redfern is an Irish person. So at the end of the first novel, they break out of this penal colony and go their separate ways. Redfern returns to Ireland, and Isaac goes to the Caribbean and becomes a privateer, captain of a ship, actually, of a pirate ship. So years later, they end up in South Carolina. Redfern ends up there because he discovers he has a love child, and he set out to try to find this child. Mallow, Isaac, ends up there because of a hurricane. He's shipwrecked on the coast of South Carolina, close to Charleston, or Charlestown, they called it at that point in time. The problem was they're there, they don't know that they're together. They were friends, but now they discover each one separately that they're on different sides of the revolution. They get caught up in the American Revolution in South Carolina. And so the story kind of tracks or continues on independent parallel tracks until the two old friends meet at Kings Mountain at the battle. As the battle rages on, they confront each other, and now they've got to make a decision whether loyalty to a cause or to a friendship will determine whether one dies and one lives. So that's kind of a brief overview of the novel. I can fill in some of the meat on the bones of that if you want me to do it.
I think people should buy the book and read in between. But
Okay.
I am interested in, and I think everybody else would be interested in your perspective, not being a native-born American, being Irish-born, coming in, writing about that time that you did in Breakout from Sugar Island, and then going into this next book. Why this time period? What was it?
I've always been interested in history, and Ireland is an island country with a long, sometimes frequently tragic history. You had wars, probably every century, 2 or 3 wars. You had people driven from their homes, land was stolen, famine occurred regularly. So in a way, that's positive for a writer because there's so much turmoil and so much danger and struggle for survival that there's 1,000 stories you can write about that is built into it. And as I said, I got the premise for my first novel from that time period. So I would say that's a plus, that you can get stories and you can get the ingredients of a good story in a time period like that. There are negatives as well, and I think the negative is that distinct from writing contemporary fiction, you can't rely on that. You can't go into a restaurant and tap into the zeitgeist or into the cultural movements and get some kind of a quote or an insight that you can use in the novel. I was myself and a buddy were in San Francisco about 30 years ago, and we dropped off at a truck stop, and you can figure that the buddy was not a woman at that point. We're going into a truck stop to have a meal. And we were listening to the conversation at the adjoining tables. And the first trucker says to the second guy, "I think I saw you down at the scales in Mendocino." I think it was Mendocino. And I said, "Yeah." First trucker said, "What are you hauling?" And the second guy said, "I'm slinging meat to Seattle." And I thought, slinging meat to Seattle, that's a golden nugget. And I always wished I had a place I could put that. You don't get that when you're writing historical fiction. You can't tap into that. Another problem with writing historical fiction is you cannot use contemporary language all the time. For example, I had a situation where I was trying to come up with an idea, and I ended up using the phrase ace in the hole. I thought that's the perfect line for that situation. He had an ace in the hole. Then I looked it up. An ace in the hole wasn't used until the end of the 1800s. So now what do you do? So I come up with, I think a pale reflection was he had a hidden card that he could play. So I've always been interested in history for another reason, that in my hometown, it was a very historical place. The Family Museum is there right now, and it's recognized as the famine center in Ireland.
Where is that, Seamus?
It's in Strokestown, County Roscommon. And the old British estate is still there with the large Gothic gates and the big house. And I wrote about the big house in my first novel. As a matter of fact, a lot of the first novel is around that town because I lived with that. I was surprised when I went into the house itself that there was a real connection to the United States, not just through immigration, centuries of immigration between Ireland and America, but they had a letter from the man at Yorktown, Cornwallis, the general that was defeated at Yorktown. He had either was related to that family in Strokestown. There was also a letter from the chief at Waterloo, I'm looking up, is in Wellington at that house. So it's a very historic place. And American or Irish have been going to America since the 17th century. And of course, in the Great Famine, there went almost 1 million people. So it's a period rich in history and rich in stories.
I have to say, and maybe I'm a little prejudiced, but I think that, and I'd be interested in your opinion. I think that storytelling is encoded in the Irish DNA. So I think when you look at James Joyce and you look at Yeats, you look at Oscar Wilde, poets and thinkers and entertainers. Why do you think Flannery O'Connor? Why do you think Ireland has produced so many fine writers?
Well, I think it is they call the art of storytelling Shanachies. The Shanachies were people that told stories around the fire in these small cabins. And part of it is there's a rich mythological history in Ireland as well. And there's a lot of talk about fairies and ghosts. And then a recent movie called The Banshee of Inisherin, you probably have heard of that.
Colin Farrell. Yeah.
Well, the banshee it means a fairy woman. Ban is the word for woman. But the banshee was a mythological creature that was a woman. It could be an old woman or a young woman, depending on what part of the country was told. And if you heard the banshee cry at night, that was a signal that somebody in your family was going to die. So there's a lot of that in Ireland. There's a lot of mythology about ghosts. And it was a great way to tell stories in a cabin that was lit by a candle with shadows. So you had that tradition and the Irish were great. They were really great talkers. And when they came to America, they got involved in politics and were very successful because of that. So I think that's the connection, is the country they grew up in, the mythology.
I think people will see that in your books. I love Breakout from Sugar Island. I haven't read King's Mountain yet, but I am going to. I have it. But the storytelling is wonderful. And I think the insight into people and character, the plot of even Sugar Island was wonderful, but it was the characters and the interaction and insight into people and the authenticity and honesty in portrayal of characters. And I think that's something that people will find when they read your books.
Another thing I just thought of that may lend to storytelling as a form of entertainment. Ireland was dominated by Britain for 800 years. And they were literally reduced to beggary. Their lands were stolen. The place where I lived, which is the town, Strokestown, the local landlord owned 20,000 acres. Everybody else owned nothing. He had his own agents that owned more, and they subleased it out. A result of that is, if you're dominated for that long a time, it's almost in your DNA. You speak in code and you tell stories. And there's a joke told about if you go into an Irish pub and something has happened and you're a stranger and you're trying to listen to them, you won't have a clue what they're saying, because they'll say, well, you heard about your man over there, right? Sure I did. But what else can you expect from him? And that kind of talk will go on for a long time, and you wonder what they're talking about, because it's almost like in one of some novel, I can't think what it was, but Barry Fitzgerald is in the movie. And he said,
love Barry Fitzgerald.
He's like, I'd go to the pub now and have a drink and talk a little conspiracy. And there was all this conspiracy talking because you're plotting against the man, the English guy. And so in a way, another thing about writing historical novels about Ireland is you have a built-in protagonist in all its different shapes. England. And that's why when Redfern goes to America, there's no way he's going to side with the British because of his history in Ireland. It just is not in his DNA. So he sides with the Patriots, forgetting that he was a slave in Barbados that was run by the English. So there's a kind of a contradiction there.
I think you have all kinds of conflict. You have the political conflict. You have that overarching conflict of the political situation there, and then you have, a much more intimate, much more human, much more primal conflict of, relationships and what's more important, and a bond that forms, with under mutual distress. Then to have that bond tested, that's a very primal bond. So to see which is stronger. So,
well, and the bond between Isaac and Redfern has been tested, because Isaac, when he gets to South Carolina, first of all, he was in a part of South Carolina, and I put this in the prelude, it's called the Upcountry, and it's really a swampy, forbidden terrain. And I have two people talking, and the trapper says to me, he said, that's the part of South Carolina where all the thieves, beggars, and misfits go. There ain't much law or religion in that place. And a lot of them are Scotch-Irish. And Redfern says to him, what are you? Where do you live? He said, I live in the upcountry. And he was Scots-Irish. So, but Isaac was confronted by a very different reality when he got to America. He could understand Barbados, that the West Indies were filled with slaves, Irish slaves and Africans. When he got to America, he discovered, like, he is captured after the shipwreck, and he's arrested, and he is condemned to be hanged. The rest of the crowd, they were all black except one Irishman. They were not sentenced to death. They were going to be sold into slavery. So Isaac knows that this is not a place he wants to be. And he says to Redfern, what the new republic, they're setting up a slave republic. And that was well-founded, given the situation that went on. There's a phrase that racism was at the heart of American democracy, of the American Revolution. And I don't think that's any great insight, and that racism was the original sin of American. And the fact that Black people went through that, and they had a clear choice. They didn't want to belong to the revolution because they know what it would get them. It would be back in chains. Thousands of them immigrated with the British to Canada because the British were moving towards abolitionism. And that scared the Americans to death because, after all, this was a counter-revolution. It came from the top down. And the counter-revolution was, they discovered, oh my God, we will lose our workforce. If Britain is moving in this direction, we will lose our workforce. And there was a court case in England back in 1770. I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, but it's important because it was an American slave brought to England by an American plantation owner. And he escaped and he was captured. And the plantation owner put him in the hold of a ship and was bringing him back to America. And the British seized the slave and said no. So there's a large trial called the Somerset case. And it was very complex and went on for months. And in the end, the judge says the Black man walks free. He said, no, he will not take him back. Well, that news telegraphed across the Atlantic to Jefferson, to Hamilton, all of those guys, and I thought, oh, we're in real difficulty. So that may have more been the cause of the revolution, because they were going to lose their economy. Also, another reason that they may have, wanted to break away from Britain was that the Americans were the westward movement. They wanted to push back and go further. The British didn't want to do that because they didn't want to irritate the Indian tribes of the neighborhood, of the region. So one final thought on that, I got a little bit of pushback because I explored that in the novel. And this person said, well, this sounds like CRT, which is that theory that's being bandied about. Well, I said, well, no, it sounds like what happened in America. Race was always a factor. CRT is this, I understand, is to be some system of thought where they critique American institutions like law, colleges, jobs, all of that, and see how it negatively impacts Black people because of racial discrimination. But I think the Black people understood that, and a lot of them headed for Canada.
Interesting. Well, I think if you're looking for a book that's entertaining and engrossing and different, I mean, this is a premise that you don't, it's not like you could pick up this book and say, well, there are 6 other books like this on the shelf.
On companies that like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobe, and hopefully I'm going to get into some private bookstores as well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we wish you the best of luck. Continued luck. Irish luck.
Irish luck.
Irish luck
Okay,
on the book and in the future. And I'd like to thank you for taking time to be here this morning and share the history, give us some interesting historical perspective, and sounding like a parish priest I listen to every Sunday for the first
yeah.
some odd years of my life. Anyway, so thank you very much, Seamus Beirne, and we will see everyone else soon on the Southern California Writers Association Hump Day Book Tour.
Well,
Till then, take care.
thank you for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it.
See you soon. Seamus.
Okay, bye-bye.